Kitted with swords, two opponents face each other, bracing for battle. One of the fighters, a young man with long light hair, begins to torment his rival, asking if he truly believes that a mere commoner could defeat him. Irritated, the opponent clenches his jaw as the fight begins. But the opponent was determined, vowing to humiliate the man. And that is exactly what he did. The cocky guy with the light hair was known as Weiss Vincent, or as the Villainous Noble. He was defeated within moments, collapsing to the floor. A guy watches the scene unfold through his video game console as the story concludes. It turns out that Weiss, in that moment, lost to the protagonist, Alan. This defeat marked the day that he lost everything. The game commentary mentions how the villain was used as a shield by the Demon King, but suddenly, the player collapses from his chair. Inside a classical mansion, a beautiful young girl can be seen kneeling on the ground. Tears fall from her eyes as she is restrained with both of her arms tied up behind her back. Weiss smirks as he stands directly behind her, a whip in his hand. He licks his lips, about to begin the unthinkable, when there is a sudden transformation to his face. His eyes widened in confusion. Where was he? And who was this girl? Weiss jumps back in utter disbelief. He was playing a video game until just a moment ago, and now he was in the presence of a woman tied up in a dirty position? The girl looked back, mirroring just as much confusion as her torturer. She asked what was wrong. It was then that Weiss noticed how beautiful the girl was. In fact, it actually felt like he had seen her before. He turns to catch his reflection in the mirror, realizing exactly what had just happened. The player had become the villainous and abusive Weiss from the game Noblesse Oblige, one that he had completed many times. And he had reincarnated as the one who stands in the way of the protagonist, Alan, in the school arc of the game. He was the lowest kind of scum who uses his power to relentlessly torment the weak. And after being thoroughly defeated by the protagonist, Weiss had to become a servant of the Demon King. His story ended in tragedy, with him being used as a shield and dying as a result. Weiss gathered that the girl must be Lilith Scarlet, known as a maid but also one of Weiss's victims. He made a habit out of tormenting her. Weiss cringed at his memories of the game. There was no question that this character was evil. Why would he think to harm such a cute girl? Weiss's first instinct was to untie the poor girl, but he knew that it may come across as suspicious if he suddenly changed his stance like that. He put on his best act, waffling to the girl that he felt like stopping his abuse for the day. He untied her carefully before seeing the bruises on her neck. Weiss suddenly remembered that he could help her. He pulled out his hands to perform his healing powers, watching the bruises disappear from Lilith's neck. The trick he just performed was only known as the player had read a strategy book on the game. Its developers kept the power hidden, although it had always been usable. Lilith gasped as she turned to Weiss, who tried his best to stay in character. He warned her not to get the wrong idea. He only wanted to practice his healing magic and did not heal her for the sake of it. But Lilith was ecstatic. She thanked Weiss, relieved, tears streaming down her face. She mentioned how she did not realize that he had these healing powers, and she was taken by surprise by his kindness. Weiss looked at the girl's smile and lowered his eyes. He apologized to her for everything he put her through up until now, promising to never do it again. Lilith's eyes widened over his words. Despite the crazy start to his day, Weiss still attended dinner. He sat alone, surrounded by his workers. His butler Zevis laid a plate in front of Weiss. Usually the noble would insult the plate and throw it to the floor. So Zevis waited for the inevitable with a nervous expression on his face. Weiss called his name, and to Zevis's surprise, he admitted he had been wrong until now. He admitted although he had treated the food carelessly in the past, it had always been perfect. Zevis was lost for words at his master's comments. He cried out, honored to be receiving such compliments from Weiss. Weiss watched as his workers sobbed. Even though their responses are sweet, you do need to admit that it is only a meal. Do these people think that Weiss had matured? They're so moved by his compliments that they haven't even noticed a completely change to his character. It was evident that the old Weiss must have been really cruel to them, but the new Weiss swore that from now on, he was going to make sure not to hurt the poor girls at least. He opened up his wardrobe and pulled out the whip. His promise would begin by getting rid of it. Weiss walked towards the furnace with the whip in his hand. He promised himself that he would change even more. As a noble, Weiss was obligated to attend a good academy by the age of 15. The entrance exam for that school was only 2 years away. After Weiss lost to the protagonist in the combat test, the reputation of Weiss started to decline and negative opinions began to form. However, if he had not lost to the protagonist, his future would have looked really different. In that case, Weiss had no choice other than to just go for it, even if it takes all of his strength. Weiss watched the whip burn under the heat of the furnace as he struggled under the intense heat. He was approached by S-rank adventurer Milk Avitas, who immediately asked if he was taking everything seriously. Weiss started to waffle, insisting that he was, but he felt like he could not even move anymore, suggesting to take a break. Milk agreed that a rest would be necessary, but only if he wanted to be called a loser right after enrolling. Weiss stared at her, a single droplet of sweat falling across his face. It turns out that Weiss used his family's connections to ask Milk to be his teacher. Originally, she appears at the end of the game and is considered the swordsman closest to being the strongest in the royal capital. Weiss insisted for her to forget that he was a noble and to train him without mercy. Despite Milk initially seeming sweet and pretty, she was actually really sadistic. Weiss heard his name being called and turned around to see Lilith. She hands him a cloth as per his request, and he thanks her. Lilith curiously asks what the writing meant on the fabric, and Weiss explained that it writes, "I will do my best to the point of dying." He tied the cloth across his forehead. Noblesse Oblige is a game referred to as a death game. It's a high difficulty game that you can only clear by repeatedly playing it. Weiss knew that if he neglected his preparation, it will result in immediate expulsion or even death. He knew that he could not afford to waste a single second, but he had never properly trained even in his past life. Although training was physically exhausting, Weiss knew that it was an integral aspect to swordsmanship and magic. He started his day by practicing forms and later going on a run to improve stamina, and then finally ending with some muscle training. He was committed to this routine from morning to night, over and over again. He even went as far as ordering his food to contain as much protein as possible to supplement his training. 2 weeks of vigorous training passed, and Weiss sat down at the dinner table. He was joined by Zevis, and immediately apologized for being a burden at such a busy time. Weiss started to eat his nutritious meal, knowing that he could mend his injuries by magic. All he needed to do was to stick to his diet now. Weiss thanked Zevis for his support, thankful that he could now even manage to do some overwork. Despite having a lot of time and support on his plate, Weiss was fully aware of how challenging his training routine was. In fact, it was to the point where a single day felt like a month. Weiss made the decision to call the magic teacher since he finally got used to the physical training. He hoped that the teacher was kind, considering how tired he had been getting as a result of his schedule. There was a knock at the door, and Zevis ordered the guest inside. The teacher walked into the mansion, immediately introducing himself to Weiss. But to Weiss's horror, the mystery teacher turned out to be Milk once again. He cried out in frustration. Milk explained that she was not only a master of swordsmanship but also of magic, before asking him what the point was in reappearing in the same composition. Embarrassed by the situation, Weiss asked Zevis why he didn't call a kind teacher. Zevis whispered that Milk was a genius magic swordsman who can use 2 of the 4 great magic attributes. Milk butted into the conversation to ask Weiss if he expected her to be gentle. Weiss was mortified that she heard his conversation with Zevis. Milk promised to teach him magic gently and that he should leave it all to her. The magic lessons began, with Weiss erupting the place into magical flames. His senpai taught him the correct stance and how to maximize his powers. The training left Weiss exhausted as he begged Milk to show him some mercy. The magic lesson was even tougher than the sword training. Despite seeing how tired Weiss was, Milk ordered him to keep going for another 2 hours. She explained that in order to use magic, he will need mana, and the only way to increase that mana was through consistent training. She ordered him to repeat the same actions every day until he passes out. Weiss was completely overwhelmed by this. So from that day on, in addition to basic magic training, practical training with wooden swords also began. Weiss inevitably got injured during the swordplay as he collapsed to the ground in pain. Milk knelt down, placing her hand gently onto Weiss's back. He was healed in no time. Lilith was sweet and supportive as always, vowing to help Weiss with his healing magic. But Milk had other plans for the girl. After all, Weiss was surprised that someone as lazy as him was able to work so hard. In his past life, he was a living corpse, immediately running away from things he had to face. Why was he so hard-working in this life? What was the difference between his past life and now? 2 months passed in no time. Weiss sat on a tree stump by a waterfall when he suddenly felt a pat on the head. It was Milk. She congratulated him on achieving his goal in 2 hours, mentioning how he made quite an improvement. Weiss wondered what she meant by that. Was it an attempt to treat him gently? Milk explained that every time he was to achieve a goal, she would give him a head pat. Weiss smirked at her comment, mentioning how it felt like the ratio of carrot to stick was off this time. Milk dismissed his comment before Lilith approached them. She was clutching hold of a box before explaining that she had brought him some lunch. She smiled sweetly, giving Milk an opportunity to tease Weiss even more. She tells him that he has probably gotten plenty of carrots from others, and that she was merely the one wielding the stick. Although Milk did end her lecture warning him to not forget the existence of the carrot's role, which was to support him to do his best. Weiss looks over to Lilith, understanding where Milk was coming from. He mentioned that it was due to all of his support that he was able to do his best. Zevis helped him with his nutrition, and Lilith, who was always there when he needed her, and of course Milk, who toughens her heart for his growth. Weiss admitted that without everyone's cooperation, he would not have been able to get this far. The previous Weiss and himself from his past life had one thing in common. They only thought about themselves. That's why no one supported him nor held him accountable. What he really needed was a mix of both sweet and harsh, which would motivate him to live not only for himself, and that was his goal for himself until now. He didn't want to be ruined, and he certainly did not want to die. But from now on, he vowed not to make Lilith and others who had helped him sad, and to show everyone his impressive side. For himself and everyone, he would avoid the path of destruction. He gave his magic lessons his all, completely executed every time. Milk cheered him on, explaining that he needed to try and keep going for 4 hours until he died, and then Weiss collapsed to the ground. No matter how much support he had, his new life was still tough. Weiss walked through the town center with Milk and Lilith by his side. The place was called the League Belt Town, the first place where the protagonist arrives. He heard the rustle and bustle of a fight that broke out, which made him remember how bad the security was in the town. He turned to Milk to ask her who his opponent was. It had been 3 months since Weiss first started training, so it seemed like the right time for him to be assigned to conduct a practical test in the town. He asked Milk if the actual combat was selling a fight to a random thug or something along the lines. Milk smiled warmly at him before telling him not to worry. She was thinking of picking the best opponent for him, so he should look forward to it. But Weiss did not feel at ease at all. From afar, a few sketchy guys checked Weiss out. They commented on Milk and Lilith's bodies before mocking Weiss for bringing 2 beautiful girls with him. Weiss looked over in annoyance, hearing the inappropriate comments being made about the girls. They quietened down after realizing that Weiss could literally kill them. Weiss knew that League Belt was considered the worst town, riddled with thugs and bad guys. He knew he needed to protect Lilith at all costs. Lilith looked over, mentioning that the guys were annoying, but she was ordered by Milk to just ignore them. Weiss looked over to Lilith, who was still smiling despite all the commotion. It felt to him like Lilith was radiating an incredible killing intent. Or was it just his imagination? The 3 arrived at the Adventurers Guild, where they came across more hooligans. The men surrounded Weiss, ordering him out of their territory. Weiss suddenly realized that he was in the presence of the Boudon brothers, who were actually his opponents. Milk told him that the 3 were responsible for a number of serious crimes against innocent victims, and they have been overlooked completely by paying bribes. But the military police who accepted the bribes had already been arrested, leaving it down to the 3 brothers who needed to be dealt with. Since they were criminals, there was no need for Weiss to hold back. Milk advised that they were the perfect opponents for a real battle. Weiss smiled sheepishly, suggesting they all head back. His foolishness was dealt with immediately by Milk, who gave him a kick. She told him that although he was determined, he had no real combat experience, and that real combat was a path that he must eventually take, so he might as well get over it now. Milk knew that if Weiss missed this opportunity, in the next real combat, it would not be guaranteed that she would support him from behind, and that could be fatal to Weiss. She reassured him that if he was to fight now, she would be right here with him, and if things get dangerous, she can step in to help. Weiss was flattered by her words and listened to her coerce him into his first battle. That was until he looked behind and she was gone. He was left all alone. Weiss realized that Milk had tricked him with her words, telling him to go into the fight with confidence just to disappear. With Lilith, too. He would have never picked a fight if he knew that she was going to vanish. He panicked as he tried to think what to do. There was no way he could choose to back down now just because he was scared. He knew that he had no choice but to brace himself. The goal was to cut off one of their arms. Weiss knew that there was no need to kill them, but it was 3 versus 1. Even he didn't know if that left him with a fair shot. And on top of that, he was convinced that the 3 were skilled fighters, despite looking like trash from the street. Weiss knew that if he was dragged into an alleyway, a fight would start whether he would like it or not. So he needed to come up with a plan before that. He knew that there was one thing he needed to do before starting the battle. Remembering Milk's words and her insistence on following her advice, he begins to follow the 3 men, knowing he could not get out of it now. Milk and Lilith watch from afar as Weiss is led away. They even both got themselves a drink. Lilith scolds Milk for giving Weiss false hope, but Milk defends herself, mentioning that he would have never gained the motivation if she did not tell him what he wanted to hear. She enjoys her drink, explaining to Lilith that it wouldn't be real practice if Weiss knew that he would definitely have backup. But of course, if things get ugly, she would go and step in. But as 2 beautiful young girls sat alone in a tavern, it was not long until they attracted some unwanted attention. A man recognized them from before, mentioning how lucky he felt to see them again. They commented on Lilith's beauty before informing them that they are actually a gang of thieves who run the town. The man smiles, explaining that he needed some girls to hang out with him that night. Lilith looked at the sketchy man and saw nothing but red. Weiss followed closely behind the 3 men who turned their back to him. It was no surprise that they did not see him as a threat, identifying him only as a strange boy on their turf. Weiss seized the opportunity and grabbed hold of his sword, swiftly slashing the first man's hand off. The man cried out in agony, causing his brothers to whip around. Weiss knew at that moment that he had to move. He remembered what Milk taught him, that the most important thing in battle is to catch the opponent off guard. The first strike that catches the opponent off guard surpasses any attack. Even a master of magic will die if they are hit before they can prepare their baron, and even a master of martial arts would die if their neck is broken before they can brace themselves. In short, Milk taught him that he needs to move before his opponent does. Weiss took her advice in that moment and kicked his second opponent directly in the face. The final brother approached him with a butcher's knife. Weiss thought that he had always been the one to put off making decisions. He always left it, hoping that the future version of him would sort it out. But now Weiss knew that time won't solve anything. If the things that need to be done are already decided, then from now on he is going to have to make decisions in seconds. He made a promise to himself that he will change from the lazy version of him. And in no time, the battle was over. All three brothers lay defeated on the ground. Weiss knew that the reason why he won was because he moved before the enemy. He knew that if he had entered the alley, the brothers would have surged with mana and increased air defensive strength. If all three of them had entered combat readiness at the same time, there would have been no chance of winning. Milk and Lilith finally appeared, with Milk mentioning that Weiss's success has earned him 70 points. She commented that if she was in his shoes, she would have just gone ahead and cut off the man's arms inside the Adventurers Guild. But Lilith, on the other hand, was supportive as ever, telling Weiss that he deserves 200 points in her eyes. Weiss was dismissive to their conversation, instead asking them bluntly why they left him alone. Lilith apologized, laughing it off nervously, but Weiss noticed a single mark on Lilith's blouse, a droplet of red contrasting against the white. Was that blood? Weiss asked Lilith what happened, but she told him it was just his imagination. That day, more than 20 members of the notorious band of thieves were arrested. Although there are no fatalities, the bandits were beaten to the point they could no longer speak. A young girl with light hair read the news article on the incident from her gazebo. She stared at the photograph of Weiss which appeared in the story. She looked up, recognizing his name, and after that, a letter of thanks and a cash reward appeared at the Vincent family house. Weiss opened it, seeing the letter mention something about a band of thieves. What was that about? A year and a half passed since training began, and Weiss had grown in more ways than ever. Usually facing problems such as running out of stamina and collapsing from exhaustion became a thing of the past, and Weiss had become able to detect the enemy's presence through the wall. He could feel the mana flowing through his body, knowing that he had grown significantly. Lilith and Zevis asked Weiss how his training was going as he sat at the dining table. He responded that it was going well. With that being said, he did have a hard time with Milk's Spartan training, which covered the 4 elements of magic such as fire, water, wind, and earth. His task was to train them all equally. He thought to himself that Milk was such a demon. In fact, in a way, she was worth more than the Boudin brothers he beat up before. Zevis mentioned that the reason why Milk was so strict with him was probably to serve Weiss's talent. He explained that originally magic is supposed to be 1 element per person. Even for an S-rank adventurer such as Milk, she was only able to use 2. However, Weiss on the other hand had enough strength to use all 4, which was considered an exceptionally rare talent. If Weiss had remained lazy, this talent would have never developed. Zevis knew that in the past he was surprised by Weiss's carelessness, but he never expected him to keep working diligently without giving up, until he finally reached that level. His work ethic truly impressed Zevis. Soon after, Weiss participated in class again with Milk and Lilith by his side. He cried out, collapsing to the floor. He begged Milk to not hit him again. Lilith jumped to his defense, telling Milk to stop breaking his poor nose with her wooden sword. But Milk looked down at Weiss in fury. She accused him of practicing magic behind her back. Weiss yelled out that he was sorry, and Milk asked him to show her what he had been doing. Weiss got up, holding both of his hands up to perform his trick. Milk observed, instantly noticing him to be performing with both light and dark elements. On top of Weiss being able to use all 4 elements, he could also use the special ones such as light and dark. She asked him why he kept his knowledge a secret. Weiss responded that he only wanted to show it to her after it was complete, explaining that he still needed to get the full hang of it. But since both Milk and Lilith were spectating, Weiss knew that he needed to complete it to perfection. It was his original magic, combining both light and dark magic. He placed his hands higher and gave it everything he had. This was a year and a half's worth of effort. That evening, guests arrived at the mansion for a formal party. Weiss stood amongst his guests, yawning obnoxiously. Lilith asked him if he was tired from staying up too late, or instead from yesterday's intense training session. Weiss let her know that he was fine, and after the training, his original magic had successfully been completed. Light elements healing magic and dark elements curse, and of course the magic that combines both of these. Weiss explained that they both automatically heal all allies within a certain range, yet continuously passes damage to the target recognized as an enemy. Although he succeeded in completing this technique, the mana consumption was insane, and he exhausted himself afterwards. But Weiss explained to Lilith that he still needs more training to increase his mana capacity. Lilith smiled, suggesting that she will get him some strong booze to wake him up. Weiss tried to stop her, but she already was on her way to the bar. Weiss watched her dodge seamlessly amongst the guests, her movements like an assassin. He overheard a strange conversation. A woman's voice mentions that there are hidden guards in the Vincent family mansion. He turned around to see a strange girl with light hair. She calls his name before looking directly at him. Up close, Weiss instantly recognized her as Cynthia Violetta. How could he forget that beautiful shimmering hair and pretty eyes? There was no doubt that Cynthia was beautiful, no matter how anyone looked at her. Cynthia was the game's main heroine. She speaks to Weiss, telling him how it had been a long time since they last saw each other. Weiss's eyes widened anxiously. She asked him what was wrong, adding in that he looked like he just crushed a goblin and turned it into muddy soup. Weiss awkwardly agreed with her, fully aware that he was hated by every character in the game after all. In fact, among them, Cynthia was the one who hated Weiss the most in the story, and the one who caused the reason for his body to be covered in holes that time. Weiss thought why even decided to attend the party in the first place. Of course, as a member of the Vincent family, he wanted to show his face. But he shouldn't have participated in a gathering of such individuals. Weiss never thought that he would end up having an encounter with Cynthia anyway. He tried to calm himself down. He was still at the point where he had not enrolled, and he had not done anything to be hated by Cynthia yet. But his mind flashed to a memory of the previous Weiss. Him covering her mouth with his hand and drawing his sword. Cynthia looks into his eyes, letting him know that she has not forgotten what he did to her. How he used his title to forcefully invite her into his room and trying to taint her with his filthy hands. She called him a trash noble, her voice like poison. Cynthia continued to interrogate Weiss, asking how he even had the audacity to attend the party. Weiss gulped, now fully aware that she loathed him so much that he felt like he could truly die from it. He knew that the only thing he could do right now was to apologize. Amongst the crowd of people, Weiss bowed down to Cynthia, admitting that it was all his fault. He admitted to being an unworthy noble and fully regretted his actions in the past. He knew that he may never be forgiven, but Cynthia was not so cruel as to trap someone who is genuinely reflecting on their actions. She lets Weiss finish his apology before finally speaking. Cynthia admitted that she thought that she would never see Weiss lower his head in front of others. Weiss looked up at her and smiled, knowing that even if it was just a bit, she has definitely calmed down. He hoped that the interaction would reduce the chance of his downfall in the end, for this was all he could do now. He knew that he should quickly find the right moment to leave, but his initial plan was to get a little closer to who he liked in the original work. But he knew that himself and Cynthia were like light and darkness, never meant to cross paths. Just like the hero who got too close to the sun, even if a noble like him, raised in disgrace, approaches a well-bred young lady, it would not work well. So unfortunately, he had no choice but to withdraw it there. He held on to Cynthia's hand as the two held their gaze for a moment or so. In the crowd, Lilith watched Weiss with Cynthia as Weiss pulled her in for a dance. Cynthia never looked away from Weiss's eyes before whispering some dirty words into his ear. Weiss gulped, truly believing the girl to be crazy. Both Weiss and Cynthia sat under the gazebo on a sunny day. Cynthia mentioned how great the weather was as they both enjoyed their tea, hearing birds chirping. Weiss agreed with how lovely the day was, but deep down he wondered why Cynthia was at his place. The events that led to this very moment started the previous night, as Weiss asked Cynthia if she would like to dance with him. He remembered how he was randomly invited to a formal dance where he met the heroine Cynthia by chance. As they danced together, she commented on how Weiss looked like he was puzzled. The fact that he had changed so much. It seemed like Cynthia knew about his daily training in preparation for entering the academy, though some rumor among the nobles or something like that. Weiss asked Cynthia if she truly did not remember much about that day, or in other words, the attempted assault he made towards her. Weiss awkwardly apologized again, admitting that he could never say the right words anyway. He looked down into her eyes, his body against hers as they danced. Cynthia was not done with her questions. She asked if he also forgot that he said that he liked her, to which Weiss responded with confusion. The dance ended and he let Cynthia go, who greeted him farewell. But after saying that, it was true that Cynthia stole Weiss's heart. He watched her walk away, but thankfully for him, it would not be the last time. A man with light hair arrived, and it turned out to be Weiss's father, Aggeto Vincent. Weiss actually found a letter from his father shortly after, which read something about a dinner party with Cynthia at his place, and despite only just seeing the letter, Cynthia's carriage pulled up outside his house. He admitted that he had a bad feeling about the whole situation, and that is what brought Cynthia and Weiss together again that day. Weiss cursed his father. What was he thinking? Deep down he was pleased to have tea with Cynthia. He did like her after all, but he knew that he could not afford to get close to her. The original story concluded with Cynthia getting with the protagonist Alan, and Weiss knew that if he was to get close to her now, the events which are meant to happen in the story will not unfold. And if the future gets changed, then he won't be able to act based on the scenario anymore. Even winning against Alan in the end could lead to changing the future, but taking the main heroine away from him would completely ruin the entire scenario from now on. So Weiss could not really win, knowing that it would be bad if he is disliked, but also bad if he is liked too. Cynthia called his name before mentioning a time where he once said that he fell in love with her at first sight. She asked him if he remembered the occasion. Cynthia added that she thought his words were too sudden, but if he was willing to show a sincere apology, then even she wouldn't be opposed to it. She gave Weiss a sweet look, which freaked Weiss out even more. He wondered how a girl could be so noble yet have such a soft side. He was annoyed that all this was happening when he was trying so hard to stay neutral. Come to think of it, in the original story, the speed at which she fell for the protagonist was quite abnormal. He recognized Cynthia to become devoted really easily, which of course was not a good thing for Weiss. He had to somehow lower her affection for him. Weiss looked away from Cynthia, but she was clingy as ever, complimenting his quiet and shy nature. Lilith appeared, holding a tray of drinks for Weiss and his guest. He thanked Lilith after letting out a big moan. Although his behavior was cringe, it might work out in his favor. Of course, a dirty moan would deter Cynthia, but it didn't seem to help at all. She continued to gaze at him lovingly, which visibly upset Lilith too. Cynthia asked Weiss if he had heard about today's matter from his father. He asked her what she meant, hearing no news at all. Cynthia explained that today's dinner party was meant to be their introduction. It would be about the story of their engagement. Weiss sighed as he sipped his tea. Cynthia continued to say how she has agreed to the engagement after both their parents suggested it. To make matters worse, that same day the brothers were plotting their revenge on Weiss. One of them, still scarred from the attack, mentioned how Weiss was similar to him in appearance. He was handsome, but he was also shy. They noticed how Weiss finally got set up with the famous lady Cynthia. Suddenly, Weiss's father appeared in the picture. He told the brothers that he set up the engagement without any hesitation at all. They all laughed, wondering if Weiss was living in his happily ever after. Weiss's father told them that he can't tell what Weiss wants just by looking at his face. Weiss was enraged by now. How had he gotten himself into an engagement from the back of a small dance? His father really hadn't arranged a tea party. It was common for parents to decide the marriage partner in noble families, but this was not some kind of parent-arranged political marriage or anything. Instead, it seemed like Weiss's father made the arrangements with the Violetta family just to make Weiss happy. Weiss remembered that his father hardly appeared in the original work. In fact, he barely knew what kind of father he was. What he did know was that his father was the epitome of an excessively indulgent parent, and in that moment, he finally understood the biggest reason as to why Weiss turned into a villain. He heard his name being called and turned around to see Lilith in floods of tears. She wished him well, asking him to be happy with Cynthia. He tried to ask her what was wrong, but it was too late. Lilith sped off before he could say another word. He turned to see Milk, who told him to chase after her. She asked if he knew the reason why he was crying before explaining that she was upset because the man she had been supporting for a year and a half was suddenly taken away by a woman who appeared out of nowhere. She added that even though the engagement was not his decision, she will not allow him to ignore the fact that Lilith was upset as a result. Milk ordered him to go after Lilith or else he will have her to deal with. Weiss did not dare go against Milk's word. On his way, he thought about how Lilith had always been by his side. Of course, she would be shocked by his engagement. If Lilith hadn't been around to support him, he could guarantee that he still would have been his lazy self. He chased after Lilith, begging her to stop, but she pleaded for him to let her go. He was shocked that he couldn't reach her despite running as fast as he could. He asked her to at least listen to him, but Lilith had already decided it was enough. She was just a maid after all, and he should leave. Weiss argued that she was not just a maid, she was someone really precious to him, and that the engagement was not decided by him but his father. The two entered the woods, Lilith still racing away. Weiss told her about the servant system at the Noble Academy, where he will be enrolling, and that only high-ranking nobles are allowed to have one servant assigned to them. He told Lilith that he planned to take her with him, because it was her that he trusted the most. Lilith's eyes filled with tears as she listened to him. She asked him if it meant that he was seeking her. She continued to run, asking Weiss if he was planning to chase after her forever. Despite Weiss being exhausted, he swore that he would. Lilith finally stopped before accepting his words. She declared that from now on she would become his mistress. But she spoke too late, and Weiss had fallen off a cliff, unable to stop on time. Lilith screamed before jumping after him. She held on to him in her arms. Lilith whispered for him to be at ease and that she would do her best. She would never tell anyone about their relationship. They both crashed into a lake, and at that moment, Weiss had committed to an affair with Lilith, not to mention that it was nearly time for the school entrance exam. Lilith and Cynthia joined in on Milk's magic lesson, learning how to perform a trick. Weiss looked down, wondering how he ended up with both his fiancée and mistress by his side. A lot of events unfolded in a single day, with Lilith becoming his mistress and Cynthia his fiancée. In fact, Weiss found the whole situation so ridiculous that he could not even wrap his head around it. He thought of his father and his place in creating this mess, swearing to get his revenge when his dad returns. His attention snapped back to the lesson, when Milk suggested for them to practice some sparring. Milk asked the girls if they have ever sparred before, to which they both agreed. Weiss was shocked to hear that Lilith had experience in the sport. And to make everything more complicated for Weiss, both his women had joined in on his training. In preparation for the entrance exam in a few months, they both requested for Milk to train them as well. Cynthia already had more than enough talent to pass with ease, but for Lilith, she wanted to support Weiss in his academics, so thought that it would be a good idea to learn too. So technically, neither of the girls needed to join in on his training. Or rather, if Cynthia, who's guaranteed to pass, puts in more effort, she might become an even more formidable presence than in the original story. Milk proposed for Cynthia and Weiss to fight each other first. Weiss's eyes widened at the suggestion, but Milk reminded him to hold his own, even though Cynthia was his fiancée. Weiss and Cynthia faced each other, ready to begin. But Milk ambiguously mentioned how she trusted him to understand even without her instruction to start. Before Weiss could even ask what she meant, Cynthia had gone in for the kill. Her sword met with Weiss's, who managed to overcome her despite the unprecedented attack. Watching the battle unfold, Milk reminded Weiss of the most important rule in a fight, with Cynthia finishing that it would be the first move that matters the most. And out of nowhere, Cynthia vanished. Weiss knew he was cooked at this point. There was a bright flash and she appeared, ready to win. Weiss knew that his fiancée specialized in ice magic, with her signature move consisting of her being able to move like she was skating. This enabled her to move with a lot of speed and attack from blind spots. But her powers were not enough this time, with Weiss eventually holding his sword over Cynthia's head. She cried out in frustration, causing Weiss to panic. Milk called the lesson off at that point to check Cynthia was okay. Milk concluded that the battle turned into some sort of counterattack since Weiss was able to swing his sword at Cynthia as she was moving at high speed. Cynthia was not injured, but frustrated that her technique that she spent months perfecting was overcome so easily. Lilith healed Cynthia's bump on her head. Milk asked Weiss how he was able to read Cynthia's high-speed movement, insisting that she should have been pretty fast. But Weiss was confused as to what Milk meant, causing Milk to drop her question, instead suggesting they see if it was just a fluke or not. Milk then ordered for the next fight to be Weiss against Lilith, to which Weiss responded with horror. He wondered why he needed to fight again with Lilith this time, but Milk had no empathy for Weiss, ordering him to stop whining. So Weiss and Lilith faced each other as opponents, and Weiss thought that there was no way he could spar with Lilith, who was just a maid, or so he thought. But Weiss did think to himself that he saw the way Lilith moved, which sometimes did not resemble that of a maid at all. Weiss tried to stay focused, knowing that if he let his guard down, he would die. Lilith clenched her sword and fought amazingly, racing around Weiss like a snake. Noticing how much he was struggling, Weiss called Milk's attention over to Lilith's movements, and as Milk watched, she realized that it was not just a fluke. Weiss was not only exhausted but confused too. In the original story, Lilith was just Weiss's attendant who barely had any screen time. He never imagined her to be this strong. She had only just begun to learn magic, but her speed was far superior to his. She also had her own knowledge in swordsmanship. Weiss knew that if he did not take Lilith seriously, he would lose. He performed a dark spell, causing a dark flame to engulf the grounds. Lilith was taken aback by the spell, knowing it was an example of Weiss's original magic. It was a skill that heals allies within the magic circle, while continuously dealing curse damage to enemies. Lilith knew that she needed to get out of the circle quickly. She noticed that Weiss hard dropped his sword to perform the trick with both hands, leaving him in a vulnerable state. She knew that if she was to leave the circle now, as someone who can only fight in close combat, she would end up being attacked suddenly with magic from the inside. She knew that now was her only chance to end the fight, so she attacked, throwing herself sword first at Weiss. Weiss remained still, a small smirk noticeable on his face. Lilith hit some kind of invisible shield which protected Weiss, sending her flying in the opposite direction. Weiss smiled, knowing his trick had worked. His original magic combined the permanence of dark magic with the protection of light magic. On top of that, he had also been using his dark eye. Even if his body could not keep up with Lilith's speed, by making full use of his dark eye and absolute barrier, he could keep defending against her attacks as long as his mana holds out. Milk looked at Lilith, asking her if she was ready to surrender. Lilith stayed silent before Milk yelled at Weiss to cancel his magic. But it was too late. Lilith collapsed to the ground. Milk used an advanced potion to heal Lilith. which worked as she rested against a tree. Weiss apologized, asking if she was okay. Milk explained that she never imagined Lilith would go down in just a few seconds. Milk asked Weiss what type of magic he used. Weiss explained that it was dark magic, which comes effective when the opponent enters the magic circle. Milk asked what the effects of this type of magic were when faced by the opponent. Weiss explained that it caused many symptoms, such as a decrease in movement, mana drain, and physical weakness. He believed that was why her mana was drained so quickly, causing her to collapse. Since Lilith has relatively little mana reserve, all of these debuffs are inflicted on her. Weiss knew that with this trick he could also add all the stats from the enemy to become his own. So the more enemies there were within the magic circle, the strong Weiss would become. And if he recognized someone as an ally, he could grant them the same enhancements. The three girls stared at him, shocked by his words. Weiss registered their bewilderment and wondered if he had said all of that at the wrong time. For he is about to say the ultimate line everyone dreams of saying after reincarnating to another world. Milk was ecstatic, congratulating him for growing this much. She insisted for him to use his power to calm her down, mentioning that it had been so long since she had been this worked up. A few months passed and not a lot changed. Cynthia and Lilith continued to learn and train with Weiss. Misunderstandings between the three remained unresolved, and Weiss continued to struggle under Milk's harsh command. And finally the day came in which Weiss had to do the Noblesse's Academy entrance exam. The Noblesse Magic Academy was the kingdom's most prestigious educational institution, sought after by all, and today marked the day of the entrance exam. Despite the Academy's great reputation, there was already a confrontation taking place at the courtyard. A huge man grabs hold of a small boy, accusing him of staring. The boy frantically scrambles, apologizing for looking. He was captivated by how big the man was, but the man would not let it go, holding his hand up to finish the boy. And Weiss then appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. He grabs hold of the man's hand with enough strength to add in a death stare in the process. Shocked, the man asks who Weiss was. By this point, a crowd had gathered to watch the drama unfold. One individual recognized Weiss, declaring that he was the infamous, abusive noble. They also recognized Lady Cynthia, daughter of the House of Violetta, who accompanies Weiss. Of course, the crowd gossiped about Lilith, wondering who the strange beauty was, and how it was possible for Weiss to be joined by not one but two cute girls. So Weiss had enough recognition for the man to realize that he was not one to be messed with. He dropped the boy and apologized, begging for Weiss not to hurt him. Weiss just told the guy to get lost, knowing that a loser like him was not worth any more of his time. He thought to himself that it had been a good while since he reincarnated, but Weiss's bad reputation was still going strong. He knew that his next objective was to be as friendly as possible to change how people viewed him. 2 years had passed since Weiss began his training, and now at last, he had arrived at the Noblesse Academy for its entrance exam. He knew that today he must defeat a certain man. The boy who got beaten up scrambled to his feet and rushed over to Weiss. He thanked Weiss for saving him and introduced himself as Alan. Weiss knew that the man he needed to defeat was Alan. It was time for the fight, and he shook Alan's hand. The warning bell rang, signaling the start to the entrance exam. A girl tugged on Alan's wrist, ushering for him to hurry up. The girl turned to Weiss and thanked him for stepping in. The girl was Alan's childhood friend, Cheryl Elias. As the two hurried off, Alan asked his friend where the Duke was. The girl mentioned that he went ahead when he saw the confrontation. Weiss watched them leave, confused over his feelings. He hesitated to shake Alan's hand at the time, and even just speaking to Alan left him feeling uneasy. Weiss was confused as to why he felt this way. It wasn't like he particularly disliked Alan, even if the goal today was to defeat him in the exam. He planned to stay on friendly terms while keeping his distance. Upon completing his theory examination, the next step was for the combat test. By this point, Weiss felt restless. He could suppress the throbbing feeling. He was instructed to change into a uniform, known to be hand-me-downs from previous students. The clothes were intended to help reduce damage from both magical and physical attacks. Dressed in his new uniform, an uncontrollable urge took over Weiss's body. He looked over to Alan, knowing that he wanted to crush him. In fact, he did not only want to crush Alan, he wanted to crush everyone in the academy. Weiss clenched his jaw, not sure what was wrong with him. The supervisor explained that the winner will be the one who either knocks their opponent out of the ring or makes them surrender. He also reassured the students that he would step in if things were to get too dangerous. The big guy held his hand up, admitting that the uniform was too small for him. The supervisor scolded him for bringing it up so late. The guy's brother complained too, which caused the supervisor to question if they were really 15. He reassured that if they passed, they would receive brand new uniforms in their size. But now it was time to get started. Lilith commented on how she was impressed that the academy was able to sort out new uniforms for their examinees, but Cynthia explained that all the spare uniforms came from the back of previous students disappearing without a trace. Cynthia smiled. mentioning how it was a sign of how difficult life gets after joining the academy. Noblesse Academy was known as the most prestigious and brutal institution in the kingdom, and anyone who cannot keep up is expelled on the spot. When this happens, most students ditch their uniforms on the spot. That being said, getting a place in the school isn't actually that hard. Even the lazy guy managed to PSS in the original story. It was finally time for Weiss to enter the ring, along with his opponent Alan. The two entered the ring, the big guy still complaining before he was told to leave. And suddenly it began to rain. The water hit everyone but Weiss and Alan as they faced each other. Alan asked Weiss to make the fight a good one since he never expected to battle against him. Weiss heard Cynthia and Lilith cheer him on, and in no time the battle began. Weiss raised his sword in seconds, knocking Alan out flat. Alan remained on the floor crying out in pain as Cynthia and Lilith looked in horror. Weiss knew that he could not suppress his feelings, that intense urge to destroy Alan. Weiss walked over and picked him up by his collar, noticing how amazing it felt. He had never felt anything like it, and in that moment he knew that this part of him was not natural. Could it be the inner Weiss coming out? Milk and Zevis sat at the end of a large table as they were interrogated with what they did to Weiss. Both Milk and Zevis stayed silent. The meeting was held to discuss Weiss, who had impressively broken the Noblesse Academy records in not one but every single exam. The meeting was held by the Noblesse Magic Academy headmaster Gills, who asked who raised Weiss to make him turn out this powerful. Gills was not impressed. He regarded Weiss's mannerisms to be dangerous. Gills was interrupted by Darius, the academy's instructor, who defended that Weiss technically didn't break any records. While Weiss's scores are indeed the highest in the academy's history, there was a student last year who tied with Weiss. Milk insisted that she did nothing special for Weiss. At most, she provided him with some basic training. Zevis agreed, explaining that he only provided him with his meals, asking if extra protein would give any suggestion how Weiss became so powerful. The instructor asked Zevis what he meant by protein, and Zevis listed a bunch of foods he added to Weiss's meals. The instructor snapped, convinced that basic training and extra protein was not enough for a mere teenager to create those results. Weiss had mastered the 4 main attributes alongside the creation of light and dark magic. Milk enjoyed her drink, not sure how she could contribute to the conversation anymore. The instructor was shocked to see her drinking and asked who provided her with alcohol in front of the headmaster. The headmaster asked Darius to relax, mentioning how he remembered Milk to have always been like this. But Darius was upset, especially thinking about how hurt Alan was after the exam. He nearly died a few hours ago, all because of Weiss. The instructor mentioned how Alan was someone he trained, and he had exceptional talent. He looked over at Milk, who had slumped her head over the table at that point. Darius was furious over the lack of respect shown both in and outside of battle. Milk held her head up, blaming Darius's anger to be nothing more than jealousy, just because he essentially lost in a serious match. But Darius argued back that Milk was irresponsible, and none of this would have happened if she guided Weiss properly in the first place. The headmaster ordered them both to stop. It was said that despite the concerns about Weiss's enrollment, it was evident that Weiss would never use his power against the weak. He had changed. And rather than being consumed by his own abilities, he pushed himself with genuine effort to become a man who is strong and courageous. Back home, Weiss, Cynthia, and Lilith found their acceptance letters. They smiled, happy to finally have the good news of their enrollment. The first day of school began as the students sat at their desks ready for their first lesson. Their instructor introduced herself as Chloe, a tall woman with glasses. She warmly welcomed her new students. On the day of the exam, Weiss successfully defeated Alan. Back then, Alan was consumed by Weiss and nearly beaten to death. But no matter how many times he knocked Alan down, he kept getting back up. Not only that, but Alan would grow even stronger each time. In the end, Weiss won by a landslide, but it took far longer to bring Alan down than he expected. It felt like he was being shown firsthand what it truly means to be a good protagonist. The students watched Chloe carefully, surprised to see light emerging from the back of her hand. She let the class know that each one of her students had been granted 1,000 points, and that the points are a measure, something that will follow them until graduation day. Chloe then turned to Weiss to announce that he had actually been granted 2,000. The class erupted into discussion over this announcement, wondering why he had been favored already, and if the decision was a bit too harsh on the rest of the class. A student asked Chloe to explain what the points meant, but Chloe suggested that rather than her explaining with words, it would be easier for the class to understand through experience. Chloe instructed everyone to grab a wooden sword and head to the training grounds. It was there that the class began their combat test. She explained that although she congratulated the class on their enrollment, she could not promise that they will make it through to graduation. Chloe announced that any student whose points reach 0 will be expelled on the spot, to which the students remained silent. And to make matters worse, Chloe suggested for the students to fight today until one student's points hit 0. Back home, Milk's day had become nothing short of eating and drinking. She felt like every day felt so empty without Weiss keeping her busy. Milk came up with an idea to get a teaching license at the Noblesse Magic Academy, to kill some time.